The following program is part of a college course. These telecourses allow you to earn college credits at home. For more information, contact a college or university near you.
The living world seems infinite in its diversity. Yet beneath the differences, there is unity as well, characteristics shared by all living things. But what is life? What makes the starfish different from the rock it sits on?
When I think of life in three ways. I think of life as a set of chemical reactions. I think of life as a series of physical activities. And I think of life in its most wondrous form as the integration of the physical and chemical laws that govern our universe in a very special way to make a living creature.
Life is easy to recognize, but sometimes difficult to define. Yet all living things share fundamental characteristics. They are organized into increasingly complex structures, from microscopic cells to organisms. They obtain and use energy to sustain themselves in a process called metabolism. They sense and respond to their environment. And most amazingly of all, they reproduce and pass on characteristics to a new generation of life in a never-ending cycle. But in order to keep this cycle going, all life needs an input of energy.
The nature of life is a very highly ordered system, whether you're talking about a single-cell bacterium or a tree or me. It is taking a constant amount of energy just to keep me alive for this moment. And so we call it a second law of thermodynamics, which demands that energy be expended to maintain order. It says that if you have a system which is highly organized and complicated, to keep that order, you have to constantly invest energy into the system.
Energy from the sun powers life. Sunlight is captured by plants, called producers, which use the energy to forge complex organic molecules from raw material in the soil and air. Consumers, usually animals, then acquire energy by eating plants or other animals, which have stored the energy in their living tissues. Finally, decomposers, fungi and microorganisms, harvest the last bit of energy from the waste products and dead tissue of plants and animals. The decomposers return living matter to its essential raw material so that plants may use it again. Thus, materials recycle through the living world while energy, dissipating as heat, flows through life, powering its many activities. Even with constant energy input, life is finite. The cells that make up living tissue don't live forever. Cells must divide to renew stems and leaves, skin and bone. And cells must divide to create new individuals.
Cell division is one of the central processes of biology. If you understand how and when and why cells divide, you can tell an awful lot about why we are what we are. Why is a skin cell a skin cell? Why is a brain cell a brain cell? We're made up of hundreds of different tissues. Each tissue has its own rules for how the cells that make up that tissue divide. For example, skin tissue goes on dividing your whole life long. Of course it has to, because otherwise you'd rapidly run out of skin cells. Other tissues, like the brain, stop cell division quite early on. Well, developmental biology is concerned with the question of why our cells differentiate, why they take up different tasks.
A cell, the basic unit of life, forms all living things. Unified by a common set of instructions that are copied for use and passed from one cell to another, the cells of a complex organism show remarkable diversity. They are different in size and shape. The folded cells of the kidney look very different from the slender cells of nerves. And they function differently. Yet for complex organisms to survive, similar cells must group together as tissues that perform a common function. In an arm, muscle tissue contracts. In skin, epithelial tissue protects the surface, while connective tissue provides flexibility. Different tissues combine to form an organ, a functioning structure, such as a vein. Or a multi-layered artery with tissues to line it. Make it elastic, contract it, and hold it together. Organs like the heart, capillaries, and veins work together to form an organ system. Finally, organ systems work together to give life to the organism.
The many different structures of life form from cells produced one at a time by cell division. So for most living organisms, production of new cells and tissues is more than a simple copying process. Life requires variation. Perhaps life's crowning achievement was the appearance of sexual reproduction, the combining of genes from two parents to make a unique offspring.
People have been arguing about why we have sexual reproduction for a very long time, since the 1930s, in fact, when R.A. Fisher, a famous geneticist, first raised the question, why is there sex? What is the point of it? And the argument is an interesting one. Fisher's argument was essentially, if you have an awfully good set of genes, why mix it up? Why break it up and pass it on to the next generation? Wouldn't it be much more sensible for you to make an identical copy of yourself? If you work well, if you are well adapted to your environment, why take a chance? Well, one answer to this is that conditions do change. And if you're beautifully adapted to one set of conditions and all your offspring are identical to you, then if conditions change, this could be a problem compared with a sexually reproducing population that produces a great variety of different offspring, such that some of them at least have a reasonable chance of being adapted to the changing conditions.
And so life continues, so different, yet fundamentally the same. Organized, reactive, interdependent, self-perpetuating, and variable. And it's all powered by chemical reactions using energy originally from the sun.
The best way I have to envision life, is to see this wonderful, complex mechanism. It's a highly complicated pattern of life, and it's a process of degradation of molecules to give energy, and a building up of all of these little molecules into complex, large molecules, into cells and tissues, and the sum is life itself.
In the astounding world around us, our observations of life lead to many questions. How do trees reach toward the light? How does a fish breathe underwater? How is a seal like a human? Why have animals evolved with such amazing differences? Curious by nature, we humans use science to search for answers.
Well, science is a way of looking at the world. It's not really a thing, it's a process. And with that process, we use a lot of tools and other things in science, but that's just a way to observe more carefully. The scientific method is organized common sense. Most people will tell you it has 5 major steps: observations, hypothesis, tests, results for those tests, and conclusions.
Biologists like these use the scientific method to systematically increase our knowledge of the world, many times to solve very real problems. Mosquitoes, carriers of life-threatening disease, began to increase despite pesticide spraying. The biologists began their work.
First, they use a process of selecting a problem that they want to work on. That has to be something that is practical, they have the background, and then they begin to work on that problem. They ask a question.
Why were the mosquitoes increasing, asked the scientists, when pesticides should decrease their population? Their guess? The mosquitoes were becoming resistant, immune to the poisonous spraying. A guess based on some knowledge is called a hypothesis.
You make this hypothesis, which is an educated guess. Not true, it's an educated guess. But the game you play is this. I assume that the hypothesis is true. If the hypothesis is true, these deductions follow automatically. Then you test those deductions by observation and experiment.
The real key to using the scientific method is to come up with testable deductions from the hypotheses. A really good scientist, a great scientist, uses very insightful guesses for their hypotheses, but also they're exceedingly clever with the way they test those hypotheses.
The scientists devised a way to test resistance to a pesticide. They discovered a much higher concentration of an enzyme in the mosquitoes that were surviving. This natural enzyme in their bodies made them into super mosquitoes, resistant to chemical spraying, while others were susceptible. Now the scientists asked, did the pesticide actually cause resistance to develop?
You'd have to come up with a way of testing the original population before the pesticides, that's your control, and then you compare it with a much later population. And if there's a difference between the two groups, then that difference is because of the one variable that was there, the pesticide.
Scientists use control groups to ensure that they test only one variable at a time. For example, they tested mosquitoes from an untouched area and found that the insect's enzyme level was normal. In areas that remained pesticide-free, resistance did not develop. In areas treated with the pesticide, the mosquito population changed. It's important that scientists confirm their results.
Verifiable, repeatable information is the basis of scientific statements. If I say something about whatever aspect of nature, that I happen to be studying, other people with the same training, with the same equipment, the same ability should be able to repeat those observations and come to the same conclusion.
Scientists showed that the mosquitoes had indeed developed a resistance to the pesticide, so spraying with that particular chemical was useless. The hypothesis was proven to be correct through verifiable data, the last step of scientific method. But just because a hypothesis is correct does not mean that science stops there.
In the case of facts in science, we do not regard those as ultimate fundamental truths. They may behave as though they are.
The problem is that as we get better tools and better ways of observing, we actually see things a little bit differently, so facts change. But that's actually considered the progressive nature of science, the fact that it doesn't stay the same, but things change.
So what we try to get are the best explanations that we can get for any phenomenon, and reach the point where this is true beyond all reasonable doubt. And we can work on that.
The fact is not important in and of itself, but as the fact points toward bigger ideas and bigger concepts, they help us make sense of our world, and that's where the theory comes in.
The way I like to use theory, and this is fairly general in the sciences, is as a body of knowledge. And that means all of the facts, all of the hypotheses, all of the conclusions in this vast field of knowledge. A theory, in a sense, can never be falsified because it can be modified, it can be brought up to date, it can be improved, and we change and we learn more and we go on. But science is a progressive thing. It builds on ideas now, it becomes better.
Observing, questioning, testing, revising, and testing some more. Scientists methodically work to increase our understanding of a diverse and dynamic world.
The fossils I work with belong to the Cenozoic era, that is the last 65 million years in what we frequently call the age of mammals.
With so much diversity in nature, yet so many shared characteristics, perhaps the greatest challenge to us is organizing our thinking about the living world. Often it is helpful to look at life's past, its origins and development, to understand life's present and even its future. Sometimes it is that which we don't see at first glance, that which we must investigate a little further, that shows us the underlying connections of all living things. Dr. Blair Van Valkenburg reconstructs the extinct animals and ecology of a not-too-distant past.
When I go to reconstruct the diet of an animal, I would look at its skull and I would measure it. I would measure the length of it, I would measure the length and width of all its teeth or most of its teeth, try to estimate the size of its jaw muscles, and I would use these measurements then to reconstruct this animal, compare it with modern animals of known diet and tooth size and jaw muscle size. Bone-cracking teeth tend to be very round, very strong. Meat-slicing teeth are very bladed. So I'd estimate the length of the blade and that length relative to that portion of the tooth row that's not for meat eating. And by taking that ratio, I can see whether it's a very carnivorous animal or a more omnivorous animal. An interesting question about saber-toothed cats is how they fed, because they have these very large canine teeth. Over the last 40 million years, saber-toothed cats were actually the typical sort of cat. And for some reason, it disappears in the Old World about 1 million years ago, and then finally in North America much more recently, 10,000 years ago.
Hypotheses about the survival and extinction of animals remain intriguing. Yet these scenarios become even more meaningful when placed in context with overarching principles called theories. In this case, the theory is evolution, an idea associated most with Charles Darwin. He proposed ways that living organisms change over time. When Darwin wrote On the Origin of Species, he based his work on numerous observations of animals and his knowledge of other scientists' ideas. It was an educated guess.
Now, that is not to say that Darwin in 1859 laid out the entire program, all of the data, all of the observations. This is still a very active field of investigation. More and more is being discovered all the time. You see, when he wrote The Origin, there were no intermediate forms, and his hypothesis demanded if evolution has occurred, there must be intermediates between something back here and something at the present time. And they just weren't any. And it wasn't until about a decade later that Archaeopteryx, this primitive bird, was discovered.
When the fossilized Archaeopteryx was discovered in 1863, it was thought to be the link between reptiles and modern-day birds. It provided evidence for an emerging pattern of ancient species diversifying, trying out new body plans. This idea helped explain not only the immense diversity of organisms, but also the common thread that binds all living things. Since that time, many extinct species appeared in the fossil record. Dr. Van Valkenburg studies the connections between some of those animals and their present-day counterparts.
About 2 million years ago, the main route of migration was from North America into South America. And those species that went into South America found a relatively empty ecosystem and tended to speciate. And this happened in the family of dogs. This happened in a number of groups of rodents, and it also happened in deer, among other things.
Darwin's theory has several components, but key to it is the idea that individuals in a population compete with each other for survival, and that the environment, on the average, separates those who live from those who die. Over time, plants and animals that survive will match the conditions around them, making them diversify.
There is a selection. Nature is making a choice. It is selecting those that are best adapted to live, but more importantly, being able to leave offspring.
In North America, we lost saber-toothed cats at the end of the Pleistocene, about 10,000 years ago. And that was probably due to the loss of their prey. Saber-toothed cats probably specialize on fairly large mammals. And the large herbivores went extinct, the mastodons, the mammoths, the camels, the horses. And so then, apparently, the saber-tooth was not able to switch to eating moose and white-tailed deer successfully, and so went extinct.
So in the cycle of life, new predators develop to match their different prey. Different prey develop to flourish with their own food source, the plants that thrived in a changing environment. Life prevailed with an immense diversity, but with remarkable similarities.
Natural selection and variation in a finite environment are the key elements of the Darwinian hypothesis as it started out. But so much came after that that it was verified, made true beyond all reasonable doubt. See, in Darwin's time, there was no genetics. He tried very hard just to see if he could get any examples of things that seemed to be inherited. The modern molecular biological techniques have probably been the most effective tools in recent years. You see, in a sense, this is another example of comparing structures. But when you get down to DNA and RNA, you're very close to fundamentals, and you can compare those molecule by molecule. And that way you can get an accurate measure of differences. The elegance of these techniques are just unbelievable. The progress being made in biology today is greater than in any time in history. It is simply phenomenal. We've had golden ages before. This is another one.
As with any theory, it is its usefulness in explaining the world around us that makes it an organizing principle. In the theory of evolution, the ideas of change over time and the interconnectivity of life with its environment help us explain the diversity of the living world, from present-day mosquitoes to ancient saber-toothed cats. And yet mosquitoes and mammals are all made of the same living cells that function in much the same way, that build tissue and muscle the same way, that use energy the same way to sense and respond to the world and create new life. Our scientific search is only beginning to explore the unity and diversity of the living world.